Every human being carries a shadow, not the one cast by sunlight, but the one cast by consciousness, the part of yourself you refuse to acknowledge, the impulses you deny, the thoughts you bury, the desires you condemn. And here's the paradox. The more you ignore this shadow, the more it controls you. You think suppressing your darkness makes you good, but what it actually makes you is weak, unconscious, manipulable, because what you refuse to see in yourself, you cannot govern, and what you cannot govern will govern you. The strongest people aren't those who pretend their darkness doesn't exist. They're the ones who've learned to face it, understand it, and integrate it into their being. Let's get into that shadow, not to become it, but to master it. The concept of the shadow self comes from Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, who understood something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Within each of us exists a repository of rejected qualities, traits we've been taught to suppress, emotions we've learned to hide, impulses society has conditioned us to fear. Anger, envy, pride, lust, aggression, selfishness, cruelty. These aren't aberrations, they're human. But from childhood we're taught to repress them, to wear a mask of civility, morality, agreeableness. And in doing so, we fracture ourselves. We split into two, the persona we show the world, and the shadow we bury beneath it. Most people never reconcile this split. They live their entire lives at war with themselves, performing virtue while their shadow leaks out in passive aggression, projection, resentment, and self-sabotage. But there's another way, a path walked by philosophers, strategists, and those who truly understand power. The path of integration, not denial, not indulgence. Integration, because strength doesn't come from pretending you're only light. It comes from acknowledging the darkness within you and learning to wield it consciously. So the question isn't whether you have a shadow. You do. The question is, will you meet it, or will you let it control you from behind the curtain? Let's begin by understanding what the shadow actually is. It's not some mystical force or moral failing. It's psychological structure. The shadow is composed of every part of yourself that you've disowned, usually because it conflicted with your self-image or the image others demanded of you. As children, we're rewarded for certain behaviors and punished for others. If expressing anger got you rejected, you learned to suppress anger. If showing vulnerability made you a target, you learned to hide it. If ambition was called selfish, you buried your desire for power. But here's what most people don't realize. Suppressing a trait doesn't eliminate it. It just sends it underground into the unconscious, where it operates autonomously, beyond your awareness, beyond your control. This is where Jung's concept of projection becomes critical. When you deny a trait in yourself, you begin to see it everywhere in others. The person who's repressed their own aggression becomes obsessed with calling out aggression in everyone around them. The one who's buried their envy becomes the first to accuse others of jealousy. The individual who's denied their own desire for power constantly rails against those who seek it. Look at modern culture. The phenomenon of moral outrage, of cancel culture, of performative virtue, these are symptoms of collective shadow projection. People externalizing their own unacknowledged darkness, hunting it down in others, trying desperately to destroy it out there so they don't have to face it in here. But projection doesn't free you, it enslaves you, because you're still controlled by the very thing you refuse to own. Machiavelli observed this in princes and politicians. Those who loudly proclaimed their virtue were often the most treacherous. Not because they were lying necessarily, but because they were unconscious. Their shadow ruled them from behind the throne. The shadow doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It gains power. It distorts your perceptions. It sabotages your decisions. It leaks out in ways you can't predict or control, until one day it erupts. So what happens when you refuse to acknowledge your shadow? First, you become inauthentic. You're performing a role, not living as yourself. There's a constant tension between who you are and who you pretend to be. This is exhausting. It's why so many people feel hollow despite outward success, because the persona they've constructed is at war with the self they've buried. Second, you become emotionally unstable. Repressed emotions don't stay repressed. They accumulate pressure, and eventually they explode, often at the worst possible moment, in the most destructive way. The person who never allows themselves to feel anger suddenly has a breakdown. The one who's always agreeable becomes passive-aggressive and resentful. The individual who's denied their ambition sabotages their own success out of unconscious guilt. Third, you give away your power. Because when you refuse to acknowledge your own capacity for darkness, you can't recognize it in others. You become naive, manipulable. You trust people you shouldn't. You miss warning signs. You let yourself be used. And when betrayal comes, and it will, you're shocked, because you were living in denial about what humans are actually capable of, starting with yourself. Consider the archetype of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Jekyll believed he could separate his civilized self from his primal impulses. But the division didn't create freedom, it created monstrosity. Hyde, the repressed shadow, became more violent precisely because he was denied, rejected, split off. Integration was never attempted, and the result was destruction. The Roman Stoics understood this differently. Marcus Aurelius didn't pretend he was incapable of cruelty or rage. He acknowledged these capacities within himself and chose, consciously, not to act on them. That's not repression, that's mastery. There's a profound difference. Repression says, I don't have this darkness. Mastery says, I have this darkness, and I choose what to do with it. One creates unconscious slaves. The other creates conscious rulers of themselves first and foremost. Now let's look at this through the lens of power and strategy. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince, a man who wishes to act entirely up to his professions of virtue soon meets with what destroys him among so much that is evil. Translation: if you believe you must always be good, always moral, always virtuous, you will be destroyed by those who are not, because the world contains darkness, and if you refuse to acknowledge your capacity for it, you cannot defend against it, you cannot navigate it, you cannot use it strategically when survival demands it. This isn't a call to become vicious, it's a call to become complete, to understand that virtue without strength is vulnerability, that morality without awareness of vice is naivety, that goodness that's never been tempted is not goodness, it's just ignorance of options. Machiavelli's ideal prince wasn't purely good or purely evil. He was flexible. He could be generous or ruthless, merciful or severe, honest or deceptive, depending on what the situation required. He wasn't controlled by his shadow, nor was he in denial of it. He was integrated, and that integration gave him strategic range that purely good rulers lacked. The same principle applies to personal power. When you've integrated your shadow, you understand the full spectrum of human behavior. You know what you're capable of. You know your own potential for manipulation, for cruelty, for selfishness. And that knowledge doesn't make you evil, it makes you aware. It makes you dangerous to those who would exploit you, because you recognize the game. You've played it in your own mind. You know the moves. There's a reason why the most effective leaders, negotiators, and strategists have a certain edge, a quality that's hard to name but impossible to miss. It's not innocence. It's not naivety. It's the calm that comes from knowing what you're capable of and choosing, consciously, how you wield it. Those who deny their shadow are easily provoked, easily manipulated, easily controlled through guilt and shame. But those who've met their darkness, they can't be shamed into compliance. They can't be gaslit about their own nature. They know who they are, all of who they are. And that knowledge is power. So how do you actually integrate the shadow? It begins with awareness, and awareness begins with honesty, brutal, uncomfortable honesty about who you actually are when no one's watching. What do you think about that you'd never say aloud? What do you feel that contradicts your self-image? What impulses arise that you immediately suppress? Write them down if you have to, not to judge them, not to act on them, but to see them, to acknowledge this is in me. Step one is simply recognition. You can't integrate what you won't admit exists. Step two is acceptance, and this is where most people fail. Because acceptance doesn't mean approval, it doesn't mean justification, it means ending the internal war. It means observing your darker impulses the way a scientist observes a phenomenon, with curiosity, not condemnation. You have aggressive thoughts. Of course you do, you're human. Aggression is a survival mechanism. The question isn't whether it exists, it's how you channel it. You feel envy? Everyone does. Envy is information. It shows you what you want, but haven't admitted you want. The question is whether you let it poison you or whether you use it as fuel. You experience selfish desires? Good. Self-interest is the foundation of survival. The question is whether your selfishness is unconscious and destructive or conscious and strategic. Step 3 is transformation, channeling these energies into productive forms. This is what Jung called sublimation. Your aggression becomes assertiveness, discipline, competitive drive. Your envy becomes ambition. Your selfishness becomes self-respect and boundary setting. Your pride becomes confidence. Your lust becomes creative passion. You're not eliminating these forces. You're redirecting them. You're becoming their master, not their servant. Let's make this practical. In the workplace, the person who's integrated their shadow can set firm boundaries without guilt. They can compete without self-sabotage. They can recognize office politics because they understand their own capacity for strategic self-interest. They're not shocked when someone betrays them. They're prepared because they know what people are capable of, including themselves. In relationships, integration means you can be vulnerable without being weak. You can be generous without being exploited. You can love without losing yourself. Because you know your own darkness, you're not projecting unrealistic moral standards onto your partner. You see them as they are, human, flawed, capable of both light and shadow, just like you. You can't command what you refuse to confront, and you can't integrate what you continue to deny. The ancients understood this principle, even if they didn't use Jung's language. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, wrote in his Meditations, "The mind adapts and converts to its own purposes the obstacle to our acting. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." He was talking about external obstacles, but the principle applies internally. The shadow, your internal obstacle, your buried darkness, can become the very source of your strength if you learn to work with it rather than against it. Seneca wrote extensively about anger, not to condemn it, but to understand it. He knew that trying to eliminate anger was futile. The goal was to recognize it early, understand its triggers, and choose your response consciously. That's integration, not repression. Nietzsche took this further. He spoke of amor fati, love of fate, and the idea of becoming who you are, not who you wish you were, not who society says you should be, who you actually are, in totality. He understood that denying parts of yourself doesn't lead to transcendence, it leads to fragmentation. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche wrote, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster, and if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you." This is often misunderstood as a warning to stay away from darkness, but read it more carefully. The warning isn't about encountering darkness, it's about doing so unconsciously. If you fight monsters without understanding your own capacity for monstrosity, you'll become what you're fighting. But if you gaze into the abyss consciously, if you meet your shadow with awareness, you don't fall into it. You integrate it. The Stoics called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. They would imagine worst-case scenarios, not to invite them, but to prepare for them mentally. This included imagining their own capacity for weakness, cowardice, vice. Not to indulge these things, but to know them so well that they could be controlled. This is the philosophical foundation of shadow work. Honest self-examination without judgment, followed by conscious choice. Strength and morality don't emerge from ignorance of your darker nature. They emerge from full knowledge of it, and the disciplined choice not to be ruled by it. Let's bring this into contemporary application, particularly around power, leadership, and influence. In any hierarchy, corporate, political, social, there are two types of people, those who've met their shadow and those who haven't. Those who haven't are predictable. They're controlled by unconscious drives. They project their issues onto everyone around them. They're threatened by strength in others because they haven't claimed their own. They moral signal constantly because they're trying to convince themselves, not you. And most importantly, they're easy to manipulate because they don't understand their own psychology. But those who've integrated their shadow, they're different. They move with a certain calm authority. They're not performing virtue. They simply act with integrity because they've consciously chosen it, not because they're afraid of their own darkness. They can be ruthless when necessary without losing themselves. They can be kind without being weak. They can recognize manipulation instantly because they understand the mechanics of it. They've studied their own capacity for it. This is why true confidence is unsettling to those who lack it. It's not arrogance. It's the quiet certainty that comes from self-knowledge. The person who's integrated their shadow knows exactly what they're capable of, the good and the bad, and they've made peace with both. In negotiations, this gives you immense advantage. You're not afraid of conflict because you've confronted your own aggression. You're not afraid of being disliked because you've accepted your capacity for selfishness. You're not afraid of losing because you've already faced your fear of failure internally. In leadership, integration creates magnetic presence. People instinctively sense when someone is whole versus fractured. The leader who's integrated their shadow doesn't need to prove anything. They don't need constant validation. They're comfortable with both their light and their darkness, and that comfort creates a gravitational pull. This is the ultimate power dynamic. Those who know themselves completely have power over those who don't. Not because they're manipulative, but because they're conscious. And consciousness is the ultimate strategic advantage. So let's bring this full circle. The shadow self isn't your enemy. It never was. It's the unintegrated part of your strength, raw, untamed, waiting for your conscious direction. Every quality you've been taught to suppress contains energy. Aggression contains the energy of protection and competition. Envy contains the energy of ambition. Pride contains the energy of self-respect. Selfishness contains the energy of self-preservation. Even your capacity for cruelty contains the energy of necessary ruthlessness when survival demands it. The question was never whether these things exist in you. They do. They exist in everyone. The question is whether you'll acknowledge them, understand them, and transform them, or whether you'll spend your life pretending they're not there while they control you from the unconscious. Jung said it best: one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is the work, not the work of becoming good. You're already capable of good. It's the work of becoming whole, complete, integrated. A human being who knows all of what they are and chooses consciously, moment by moment, how to wield it. The strongest people aren't those with the most light. They're those who've descended into their darkness and returned with knowledge. They've met the monster inside, and instead of running from it, they've learned its language. They've tamed it. They've integrated it. And now it serves them rather than ruling them. Machiavelli understood power. Jung understood the psyche. The Stoics understood self-mastery. And they all arrived at the same truth through different paths. Wholeness requires facing what you fear most about yourself. So here's the final question, the one you'll carry with you long after this video ends. Have you met the part of yourself you fear the most, or is it still ruling you from the dark? Because until you answer that honestly, you're not free, you're not strong, you're just performing. And performance, no matter how convincing, is still a cage. The shadow is waiting, not to destroy you, but to complete you. The question is whether you're ready to meet it.